Have you ever entered a relationship with all the honesty and hope you could offer, only to realize one day that love was slowly making you lose pieces of yourself, not because the other person meant to hurt you, but because you, in your desire to hold on to love, began accepting things you once promised yourself you'd never tolerate? There were words that stung, but you stayed silent. Moments when your pride was wounded, but you told yourself, as long as we're still together, it's worth it. You weren't weak. You just loved deeply and feared losing that last bit of warmth left in life. If you've ever felt that way, you are not alone. Many people, even after turning 70, still long to be loved, yet quietly feel small inside the very relationship they once cherished. There was a man like that. He lived through those feelings, too. And eventually, he chose something he never thought he would. He chose to walk away just to keep the part of himself he could no longer afford to lose. His story isn't just about love. It's about the long path back to self-respect after years of giving too much just to feel needed. Dear friend, the most beautiful truth is this: the answer isn't complicated. You don't need to argue. You don't need to change anyone. You just need the courage to pause, to look within, and to love yourself again gently and without shame. And if you're still here, if something in this story feels close to your own, then stay with me a little longer. Because maybe, just maybe, what comes next might be the advice for the elderly that your heart has been quietly waiting to hear. This is senior life wisdom. There comes a point in life when your hair has turned gray, your steps have grown slower, and you start to believe that love belongs to a younger version of yourself. But sometimes, love arrives quietly and unexpectedly. And in that stillness, the heart begins to stir again, even after it thought it had long settled into silence. Perhaps you felt it too, that moment when someone looks at you with gentle eyes, when a simple compliment makes you feel seen again, when being called by a soft, caring name touches something inside you that had been sleeping for years. That kind of love doesn't come with fireworks. It finds its way into your days through long conversations, thoughtful questions, small kindnesses, and over time, it brings back the feeling of being alive, not just as someone aging gracefully, but as a whole human being, still full of emotions, still wanting to give, still hoping to be loved. At that age, he didn't ask for much, just the sense that he still mattered to someone. And when love did come, he believed deeply that it had helped him find a part of himself he thought he had left behind. The part that still felt young, the part that still hoped, the part that once loved without needing a reason other than it felt true. But in trying to hold on to something so rare, he began to give things up. Not things you can hold in your hands, but pieces of the boundary that had once protected his dignity. He started to shift gently, slowly, not because anyone forced him, but because he feared losing what had brought him back to life. He stepped back, stayed quiet, did what pleased the other person, even when something deep inside him felt unsettled. And maybe that wasn't wrong. Maybe that was the instinct of someone who had lived long enough to know keeping someone is sometimes harder than loving them. But what made this story so quietly powerful was the day he looked into the mirror and didn't recognize the man looking back. Late love can be beautiful, but if, in the process of protecting it, you begin to shrink to disappear from yourself, then perhaps it's time to pause. To ask honestly, is this love still nurturing me? Or is it slowly leading me away from the person I've always been? If you've ever had a love that warmed your heart, yet made you drift from your true self, I invite you to share a thought in the comments. Because sometimes a single honest reflection can soften the quiet storm someone else is holding inside. And it was from that very place, the place where he no longer felt like himself, that he began to notice small, silent cracks forming, signs that something deeper was beginning to change. Perhaps those signs are worth looking at, too. This is the kind of senior wisdom we don't always speak out loud but deeply feel. At first, everything seemed so normal. Just a few gentle suggestions, a distracted glance while he was telling an old story, a few interruptions, small moments that made it feel like what he had to say didn't really matter anymore. Some things don't have names, but those who've lived long enough, they feel it. Little by little, something in him began to wear down, a kind of quiet erosion of his dignity. Have you ever been in a relationship and couldn't quite tell when it started, that feeling of becoming smaller? Not because someone said something cruel, but because of how they spoke, how they stayed silent, how they stopped seeing you the way they used to. These are tiny cracks, barely noticeable, but over time, if left unacknowledged, they can break not just the relationship, but you, too. He often wondered, quietly, maybe I'm just being too sensitive, or told himself, maybe it's just age making me overthink things. But it wasn't that. Sometimes your intuition is right, and sometimes the pain doesn't come from what's said aloud, but from no longer feeling seen as a whole person. When love begins to make you question your own worth, it's no longer a love that heals. It becomes a soft, invisible wound, one that drains your spirit day by day, even if it looks gentle from the outside. The hardest part, it rarely comes from one big moment. It comes from the buildup, from the quiet days when you didn't speak up, when you stayed silent and stopped asking, do I still deserve to be treated with care? If you've been telling yourself, it'll pass, it's just a phase, then maybe now is the time to listen more closely to your own heart. Dear friend, don't let your self-respect be worn away by the things you keep labeling as small, because those small things, and when repeated long enough, can make your soul more weary than any grand betrayal. If you've been carrying thoughts you haven't said out loud, I invite you to leave a comment. Sometimes, speaking them softly is enough to help someone else face their own truth. It was around that point when he realized he had been quiet for far too long that he began searching for a real answer. Can someone truly hold on to love and still hold on to themselves? That quiet question marked a turning point. It was when he began to see the widening distance between who he used to be and who he was slowly becoming inside that relationship. And that reflection, so subtle, yet so honest, would eventually guide him toward a deeper truth. The kind of advice for the elderly we only come to know with time. There came a point when he realized he had tried too hard and still felt like it wasn't enough. Some relationships make us believe that if we're just a little more patient, a little more selfless, things will eventually feel warm again. And when love arrives late in life after most of the journey is behind you, the fear of losing it grows even stronger, because second chances don't come as easily anymore. So we tell ourselves love requires patience. Love means understanding what isn't perfect. We don't want to seem difficult. We don't want to hurt someone we care for. So we stay quiet, we step back, we try to be easier to love, but each time we do, we step a little farther away from who we are. And the hard part is, we don't notice it right away. It was only one quiet evening, standing before the mirror in the same familiar room, that he finally saw it. The man looking back at him was no longer someone he recognized. Not because of gray hair, not because of the deeper lines on his face, but because his eyes no longer held that quiet strength, no longer carried the dignity that once defined him. The eyes of someone who had weathered life's many storms now looked lost inside the very relationship he once thought would be his safe harbor. Dear friend, that is a real painful moment when you begin to feel yourself slipping away from the parts of you that once felt so clear, so steady, so grounded. And then he asked himself, am I holding on to this person or letting go of myself a little more each day? It's not an easy question, especially when you've loved sincerely, when you've poured your time, your hope, your whole heart into someone. But if love has turned into something that constantly demands you to prove yourself, if each new day makes you feel smaller than the one before, then maybe it's time to pause and ask the question we often avoid. Is this still love or just the fear of being alone? dressed up as something familiar if any of this feels close to your own story. I invite you to share your thoughts below, because sometimes knowing someone understands can bring more relief than we realize. And from that very place of awakening, he began to understand there are things, no matter how deeply we love, that are not worth giving up. Because if a relationship causes you to no longer recognize yourself, then holding on to it may not be bravery but fear wearing a softer disguise. That quiet realization led him to a turning point where love was no longer his shelter, but his greatest challenge. How do you protect your inner peace when everything outside feels uncertain? That question, my friend, is where senior wisdom begins. There comes a moment in life when you stop trying to explain yourself, when you no longer feel the need to earn approval or prove your worth. Have you ever felt exhausted from constantly trying to show others that you still matter? Have you found yourself in a relationship where you had to maintain a perfect image, avoid upsetting the other person, and try so hard to be worthy of being loved? He had felt that too. But when that quiet moment came, not dramatic, not loud, just a deep stillness, he realized he was tired. Not tired from loving, but tired from no longer being himself. Love, when it starts making us shrink, when it asks us to hold back our feelings, when it makes us feel like we're never enough, eventually becomes something else. It turns into a kind of dependency, an invisible tie that slowly wraps around your self-respect. The strange thing is, we keep trying to prove ourselves because we're afraid of losing someone. But the moment we no longer feel the need to prove anything is when our soul begins to wake up. He began to understand no one, no matter how deeply we love them, has the right to make us feel ashamed of who we are. No relationship is worth the cost of losing your self-worth or your inner peace. At this stage in life, you're no longer looking to be right. You're not interested in being better than anyone. All you want is to live in a way that feels light on your heart. And if a relationship doesn't offer that peace, maybe it's you who needs to walk away, not out of anger, but out of self-respect. A person's worth isn't measured by how much they are loved by others, but by how bravely they choose to love themselves the right way. To love without losing parts of yourself, to love without constantly second-guessing your place in someone's life. And after all was said and done, he no longer looked for validation from anyone. Because he came to see this truth, some relationships, no matter how beautiful they once were, if they pull you too far from who you are, they are no longer worth keeping. Dear friend, if you've ever felt like you were straining just to hold on to something, I gently invite you to pause and ask yourself, is this love lifting me up or slowly wearing me down? If you feel like sharing, leave a thought in the comments below. Your words might just be the mirror someone else needs to finally see themselves again. And from that very moment when he stopped needing to prove anything, he was finally ready to step into a new chapter. One where leaving wasn't a failure, but an act of senior wisdom, rooted in self-respect and a quiet awakening of the soul. In the end, he chose to walk away, not because the love inside him had run out, but because he could no longer live in a relationship that made him forget his own worth. Have you ever reached that point when the feelings are still there, but your self-respect has already begun to crack, when every day beside someone makes you feel smaller, more distant from yourself, and unsure if you even belong there anymore? That choice to leave someone you once loved with your whole heart is never easy. It doesn't come from anger. It doesn't come from wanting to hurt anyone. It comes from something deeper, the quiet realization that loving someone doesn't mean losing yourself in the process. In the early days after leaving, his heart felt empty. The same room now felt larger, quieter. Meals no longer had someone sitting across the table. The laughter and familiar voices suddenly gone. But in that silence, he began to hear something again. His own voice, something he hadn't listened to in a long time. For the first time in years, he no longer had to wonder if what he said would upset someone. He no longer had to filter his words, no longer had to earn love by being enough. And he realized freedom isn't about where you can go or what you can do. It's about being able to live with yourself without shame, without pretending, without hiding any part of who you are. At this age, we no longer need big promises. We don't need someone to make us feel whole. What we need most is to live truthfully, to breathe without holding back, to feel light again because we've stopped carrying a love that no longer feeds us. And it was that very release, that letting go, that became his first step back toward himself. He didn't rush to find something new. He simply returned to the things that once made him feel at peace: a quiet cup of tea, an old familiar song, a phone call to a friend he hadn't spoken to in years. Dear friend, if you've ever held on to a relationship just to avoid the loneliness that follows, remember this: sometimes the cost of staying is far greater than the solitude that comes after leaving. If you've known that feeling, feel free to leave a comment below, because somewhere out there, someone else might be on the same path trying to find their way back to themselves, just like you, just like he once did. And through that difficult but honest decision, he finally came to understand something deeper. Loneliness isn't something to fear, not when it's the result of a choice rooted in self-respect. Sometimes, that's exactly where senior wisdom begins. At first, he didn't deny it. Loneliness arrived quietly, but uncomfortably. The nights felt longer. The ticking of the clock seemed louder. And the familiar room, though unchanged, somehow felt colder, larger, emptier. Perhaps the hardest part after a separation isn't losing someone, but feeling the emptiness stretch across your everyday moments. The little things you never used to notice now suddenly feel so loud in their absence. But as the days went on, something slowly began to shift. That stillness, once painful, no longer felt so hollow. Instead, it gave him space to breathe fully, gently, without interruption. What once felt like isolation started becoming a quiet return to himself. He no longer had to filter his words. He no longer had to meet someone else's expectations. He could slow down, listen deeply to what he truly needed, and begin reclaiming the parts of life that had quietly slipped away. He returned to old habits, reopened books that had been tucked away on the shelf, reached out to friends he had once been close to, friends who had slowly drifted into the background of life. Most importantly, he relearned how to be kind to himself, not in grand ways, but in quiet, nourishing ones. He cooked meals that suited his own taste. He rested when tired. He held space for his own sadness, without needing to explain it. He began to remember that he was worthy of care, not from anyone else, but from himself. Dear friend, if you're living alone, if the nights stretch longer than you'd like, and the silence feels heavier than usual, try seeing your solitude as a necessary quiet. Not a place to drown, but a place to heal. Not something to escape, but something to return to. Don't rush to fill the silence with noise. Let your heart stay still for a while. Because sometime, from that stillness, the things that truly belong to you will find their way back on their own. If you've walked through a season like this, I invite you to share a thought below. Your voice may be the gentle light someone else needs on their own quiet path. And it was from this silence, not bitter, but calm, that he began to look back on his journey, not with blame, but with softness. And slowly, he stepped into a new phase of life, one where he no longer waited for someone else to fill the space. He simply hoped to be at peace with himself enough to walk forward, one quiet day at a time. This is the kind of advice for the elderly we rarely say aloud, but always feel in our bones. In the end, what he carried forward wasn't sorrow, but a lesson that came late but right on time. Old age doesn't give us many chances to start over, but it does offer us enough time to look back to understand that not everything labeled as love is truly something that lifts us up. Some relationships once made our hearts race, but over time, they left us only with fatigue and quiet doubt. We think it's love, but sometimes it's simply a lesson wrapped in the familiar shape of affection. He had walked that path, from the joy of early connection to subtle questions, to a quiet, clear awakening. And in the end, what brought him the greatest peace wasn't that he had once loved deeply, but that he had found the courage to stop, so he could keep all of himself intact. Growing older teaches us this. There are boundaries worth drawing not to build walls, but to remind ourselves that loving someone should never mean forgetting who we are. Love, when it is right, makes you a fuller version of yourself. But if it causes you to shrink, to question your worth, to doubt your place in someone's heart, then it's no longer love. It's an unnecessary trade-off. He didn't blame the one who had walked beside him for a time. He didn't regret having loved, because without that journey, he may never have discovered the most essential truth. That peace was never in someone else's hands. It was always in how he chose to treat himself every single day. Have you ever lived for someone else so much that you lost sight of yourself? Have you tried to be accepted without realizing how far you had drifted from your own center? If so, you're not alone. Many people well into their 60s and 70s are only just beginning to learn how to love themselves again. Not with grand gestures, but with respect, with care, with the quiet honoring of every feeling, every limit, every moment of simply being who they are. If these words have touched a part of you, I invite you to share a thought below. Sometimes all it takes is one person speaking their truth to help another feel less alone, less invisible, and he, a man who had lived through the full spectrum of love, now walks more gently. Because he knows this loving someone is a beautiful thing. But loving yourself is the only foundation that ensures you won't lose what truly matters again. That, my friend, is senior wisdom we learn only by living it. Dear friend, at a certain age, we stop looking for passionate, grand love stories. What we long for instead is a relationship that offers peace, one where we don't have to stay alert all the time, where we don't constantly wonder if we've let someone down. Love, when it is true, doesn't make you shrink. It doesn't leave you doubting your worth. It doesn't ask you to fit into someone else's mold. True love reminds you that you are still deserving, still valuable, still someone with something real to give. Aging isn't a closing chapter. It's a deeper, slower journey inward. And the farther we walk, the more we realize that protecting our peace is the most precious thing of all. Not everyone who stays in your life is meant to be kept close. Not every connection must be maintained just because it was once beautiful. If something in your life is wearing you down, if you have to push yourself each day just to be enough for someone else, then maybe it's time to release it. You have always been enough, and who you are right now is already worthy of a calm, gentle life. Love is not a place where your self-respect should be sacrificed. It's where you can be yourself fully, freely, and without condition. If you are standing at that quiet crossroads between holding on or letting go, I hope you find the stillness to hear your own heart. Because sometimes, what we need most isn't another person to fill the silence. It's a quiet space where we can return to ourselves without guilt or fear. If these words have spoken to you, please leave a small comment below, or share this video with someone who might be in need of a soft reminder right now. Thank you for staying with me all the way to the end. And if you're still here, still listening, please believe this. There is still so much that is valuable about you, simply because you are still wholly, quietly yourself. This is senior life wisdom. And this is the kind of advice for the elderly that only life and time can teach.